Thanks for taking time to watch this presentation. This show will be a little different from our regular stamp shows in that we'll start with stamps and quickly move to the subject of photography. Just as every stamp has a story behind it, I will share the stories behind some of my favorite photographs. This is the first commemorative stamp to bear the new 15-cent postage rate. This stamp was issued in recognition of the contributions photography has made to American life. The Masters of American Photography pane marks the end of the classic collection series that began in 1994 with the Legends of the West. Works by 20 renowned American photographers are displayed on this pane in chronological order. The selvage shows a photo taken by William Henry Jackson or by one of his assistants. These artists combined daring, craftsmanship, and creativity to enlarge our view of America and the American people. Well-known images have inspired many postage stamp designs. This is just one example of a photograph and how it translated into a postage stamp. Here's another example. The Apollo 8 astronauts did a television broadcast on Christmas Eve, 1967, in which we saw the first Earthrise. Now we're going to take a turn away from talking about stamps and focus on photography. No pun intended. Well, maybe a little. Cartier-Bresson's quote is an interesting one for the digital age, mainly because we get there so much quicker than in his day. 10,000 images shot on 35mm film is the equivalent of nearly 300 rolls of 36 exposure film and its associated expense, not to mention processing time. Today, shooting JPEG images on a 16 megapixel camera, that would fit on one 64 gigabyte SD card. Here's a phrase that photographers often hear when showing their work. This would be like telling an artist, you must have really good brushes, or a chef, you must have really good pans. A good photographer can make a great photo with any camera. I started on my first 10,000 images with a Kodak Brownie camera when I was about 10 years old. The rolls of film only had 12 exposures, and you didn't see the results of your efforts for about 2 weeks while you waited for the photos to return in the mail. It was my first point-and-shoot camera, and very low tech at that. The next camera was a big step up, a 35mm camera with interchangeable lenses. There was no light meter, so you used the instructions packaged with the film to determine the exposure and aperture. With this camera, you had to choose a shutter speed and aperture before making the exposure. You learned the difference between cloudy and cloudy bright, as well as the triangular relationship of film speed, shutter speed, and aperture. Everything was mechanical. There were no batteries in sight. I was still using this camera in the mid-1970s when I took a photography elective in school and learned how to develop my own film. Other 35mm film cameras came and went over time. My first real digital camera was quite advanced in 2006. The first thing I learned at the time I purchased the camera was that Nikon only made one film camera at that time. Digital was here to stay. It didn't take long to learn that the path was now clear to 10,000 images. One day at Formula One practice at Indianapolis, I shot over 1,100 images without trying very hard. Beyond the camera, digital editing has helped me improve my images more than anything else. Before using the editor, I did not understand why anyone would want to shoot raw images. I can't describe in a brief slide why editing photography is so important, but it is. All right, enough about cameras and photos on stamps. Let's take a look at some images and the stories behind them. I never saw the ant on the daisy until I came home and loaded the photo onto the computer with a decent-sized screen. I took this photo on the street where I live with a regular zoom lens that came with my camera package. The colors are dramatically better after enhancement with the photo editor. Sadly, the brick mailbox was later destroyed by a distracted driver. The daisies continue to come back each spring. I had not seen or heard of a Star of Bethlehem until the day I took this picture. I went for a manicure and this was on Allison's workstation. Later that day, I packed my tripod, camera, and macro lens and visited the salon again to take the photograph. You can see every stage of blooming in this single stem of the plant. I took this photo on a tour of a plantation outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Our family was on a trip to Vidalia, Georgia to buy onions, and we went through Charleston and Savannah on the way. This is a normal handheld exposure. We walked across the bridge right after taking the photo. I took this photograph after the Daytona 24-hour race in 2008. The lighthouse is located about 30 miles south of Daytona Beach on the Ponce de Leon Inlet. It is the second tallest lighthouse on the Atlantic Ocean. After the race was over, we were back in the motel watching a local infomercial channel and learned of a local seafood restaurant just around the corner from here. The image was taken at sunset on a tripod, about a 45-second exposure. I took this photo on my kitchen counter shortly after getting my dream lens, a 105mm macro lens. It's another 45-second exposure on a tripod. I bought the stargazer lilies at the local grocery, and I remember the cashier commenting on how beautiful they were. I later gave her a copy of the image. It remains one of my favorite photos from the last decade. This is a combination of two images that I combined in the camera. After buying my first real digital camera in 2006, I took a free class from my local camera store presented by Nikon. It took me 3 months to get the proper exposure on the full moon, but as they say, the third time is a charm. The picture of the Louisville skyline at night was much easier to take. Needless to say, the tripod played a major role in both exposures. We started with stamps and quickly moved to the subject of photography. I shared the stories behind some of my favorite photographs. Thanks again for watching the presentation, and remember to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified of future presentations.